Welcome to the Public Voice Salon. We're an open dialogue on education, the arts, and social change. My name is John Braden. I am the host and co-creator of the show with my darling wife, Claudia Chibuki, who's filming us right now. And we are so delighted to be in the home of Nel Noddings, one of the leading educational philosophers in our country and in our world, whose work looks at caring and how to create more caring human beings, how to care about our planet, caring about our community. It's a kind of a paradigm shift away from a traditional style of education that increasingly is teaching people to be just better workers and more competitive in the marketplace economically. It's a paradigm shift, and she has been one of the innovators of this field of study. She may have pioneered it herself, teaching at Stanford University and Columbia University. She's the author of many books. One of them is The Challenge to Care, an alternative approach in education, which I discovered, I think back around 2000, when I first met Nel, who gave a lecture at Riverside Church in New York City at a conference called Reimagining Politics and Society at the Millennium. So this was a really powerful conference about new ways of looking at our society, moving away from violence, moving away from warfare. That conference was organized by Michael Lerner and Cornel West, two great intellectuals in our world. Nell spoke there in the nave at Riverside Church. It was standing room only. So she's a pretty powerful and well-respected person, gives lectures around the world, and we think that her work ought to be more well-known in the general society, in the media. And so we're here for a whole delightful hour with Nel Noddings at her lovely home in Ocean Grove, New Jersey. And the interesting thing about Ocean Grove, they call it God's Square Mile, so it's kind of a spiritual community. And Nell has talked a lot about morals, that it's more important to look at, in terms of education, even more important than intellectual or academic concerns, is the moral concern with the human being, and what kind of people are we creating? Are we creating people who are kind, who are loving, or are we creating people who create warfare and that sort of thing? And historically, I must say, this dialogue is taking place at a time when Hurricane Harvey is still ravaging Texas, and it's been said that these kind of storms are going to continue to get worse and worse if we don't care about our environment, right? So caring about our environment, caring about each other. This is a very interesting new shift in education, and Nel Noddings is leading the charge. So we welcome you so much to being on our show today, Nel, and just please introduce yourself to our audience. We'd love you to come back again, and this to be the beginning of a dialogue with you. You're actually one of my heroes, and it's a wonderful thing when you can get to interview your hero. I've been teaching for 20 years, and without your work, now, I don't think I would have been able to make it as a teacher, let alone think I have something to say about having a TV show, for example. Your work has been essential to me, and I want to thank you for that. And with that, I will shut up and give you the microphone.
Well, thanks very much, John. I'm very glad to talk with you, and I think that today, perhaps more than ever, we need to talk openly and clearly about caring for. And, I make a distinction between caring for and caring about. I mean, caring about is very like concern. We all care about the weather, for instance. We care about the cleanliness of our homes. We care about the people who are suffering in Texas. Some of us do something about it, and some of us don't. And caring for requires the establishment of relation. So care theory is, at bottom, it's a relational theory. Requires at least two people, the carer and the cared for. And if the cared for doesn't recognize the attempt to care, then there's no caring relation. And, that is, it takes a while for that to sink in on some people. I'll turn the microphone back to you in a minute, but let me just give one, I think, powerful example of this. This is a book written many years ago by Samuel Butler. The title of the book is The Way of All Flesh. And in it he describes a family. I think the name was Pontifex, the Pontifex family. The mother and father think that they are caring parents. To my way of thinking, they're anything but caring. They tell their kids exactly what to do, when to do it, how to do it. They remind their kids all the time how lucky they are to be born into this family. And you could go on down the line with this awful string of things that don't sound a bit like caring for. And yet these are people who pride themselves on the virtue of caring, see? So you can think of, if you think of caring as a virtue, then all the attention goes on the one who is caring. But if you think of caring as a relation, then you've got to see how both people are involved, see?
Oh boy, yes. And
That's the basic thing.
that was starting out with that, and when we're talking about friendship, we're talking about in communities where one senses a growing alienation in society. Robert Putnam has talked about this idea of bowling alone, that we're isolated from each other, alienated from each other.
In his later book, Our Kids, he elaborates on that. It's worth looking at too, yeah.
We've mentioned Robert Putnam a lot on our show. We talk about his work. And thinking about the nuclear threat, too, that somebody could push a button and all of life on planet Earth could be exterminated. And wow, how did we get to this point? And how do we start to move away from that? This is even, I think, has to do with terrorism and violence of all kinds. If we could begin to educate people to be more loving and caring and kind, and also create a society in which is more equitable, that, I think that's also part of the puzzle, where you have more fairness and justice, then hopefully the 21st century will not be as bloody as the 20th century. That's really what we're trying to achieve here. When we look at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, when we look at the Nazis and all that horrible violence that was perpetuated on mankind, I think the work that you are pioneering, Nel, is really absolutely essential into moving forward. But how do we convince schools that are so caught up in inertia, so caught up in the status quo? How do we convince boards of education? How do we convince, people in the educational establishment that this work is meaningful?
Frankly, I'm not terribly optimistic about it. As you know, I've taught at every level from 5th grade on through graduate school, and I loved teaching, but I think we are very much on the wrong track right now. There is so much emphasis on exactly how to do everything, the rules, the activities, the outcomes, everything specified. The learning objectives are specified, the tests are specified. There's very little room for the sort of open dialogue that I think should characterize true education. So it means that we're not paying much attention to what the kids want, what the students want at any level. We're almost like the Pontifexes in Butler's book, telling them how lucky they are to be here, how they should do exactly what we say, and if they do exactly what we say, everything will be just fine. And it isn't. It just isn't that fine. So I think we need to put far more emphasis on dialogue. It doesn't mean that we do everything the kids ask for,
Right.
of course. But it does mean that we listen to that,
Right.
and we talk about it, and sometimes we go home and worry about it. Gee, why does this kid want something that seems to us to be harmful and not helpful? And we have to think about it, and what we do the following day is affected by that kind of thinking. We're just too far off the mark right now. And the same sort of thing is happening too often in medicine, where even nurses are following the exact rules. Here is what you should do, spending far less time in interaction with patients and giving the best care as that is defined on paper, but not having time to sit down and just talk about things and see whether, in fact, the patient would like something different, the shades half drawn, or a conversation, or whatever. So that's the... I'm certainly not the only person who is interested in a change in education. We could spend some time talking about that. I think the current revived interest in interdisciplinary studies is a very promising sign. But we can talk further about that.
Wow. Just to give a little perspective on my work also in education, which began in 1997 when I taught English at Park East High School in New York City. I replaced the regular teacher who quit after 3 days, had a nervous breakdown, and they took him out of the class and they put me in, and it was like, whoa, and it was, I felt the students were in pain. I felt there was an emotional lack, which I tried to bring by creating a democratic classroom, by paying attention, by listening. But I found that the administration was not always supportive of this sort of a thing. The second high school I taught at also was very kind of an old-fashioned, this was Martin Luther King High. It was a huge school, which was like thousands of students, very anonymous, very alienating. I replaced 2 teachers who had quit. And again, it was chaotic. Was able to somehow finish the term by ignoring administration, by doing it my own way, because, I somehow got away with it. I don't know how. But the third high school I taught at was called Cascades, which was located in Chinatown. And this school was much more caring. And this school was an alternative high school created by 3 men who knew each other, and they were friends. And one of them had worked as a psychotherapist. All 3 of them had worked in education. One had his doctorate from NYU, Tommy Cheng. And so Jason Blonstein also was there, who now is a new teacher mentor at NYU. So it was a very different kind of setting. And one of the things they would do now is every Friday, the teachers would get together and sit in a circle and have a dialogue and just talk to each other and share issues and talk. We could actually talk about anything, even including issues we had with each other. So sort of clear the air emotionally so that we could focus on the students. And it was they were very open to new ideas and experimentation. And eventually the New York City Board of Ed put the kibosh on this school. Right? It was actually functioning. It was a wonderful school, but they destroyed it. And so that's when I got out of teaching in the public schools, and I began teaching college. And I found it's much easier. And then I discovered your work, which really was very formative turning point for me also, discovering the work of you and also people like Maxine Green, who became a mentor for me at Teachers College. And then this book, I read this book, your book, The Challenge to Care in Schools, An Alternative Approach to Education. And I just want to read a piece here just to give our viewers a sense of the richness of your work and the ideas, and then we can continue the dialogue here, where you talk about here this idea of moral education from the perspective of an ethic of caring has 4 major components: modeling, dialogue, practice, and confirmation. Modeling is important in most schemes of moral education, but in caring it is vital. In this framework, we are not trying to teach students principles and ways of applying them to problems through chains of mathematical reason. Rather, we have to show how to care in our own relations with cared fors. For example, professors of education and school administrators cannot be sarcastic and dictatorial with teachers in the hope that coercion will make them care for students. I have heard administrators use this excuse for being tough with teachers because I care about the kids of this state. But of course, the likely outcome is that teachers will then turn attention protectively to themselves rather than lovingly to their students. So we do not tell our students to care, we show them how to care by creating caring relations with them. I have worked in schools now where it seems like everybody's at war with each other, you know. There's a sense of competition, there's a sense of coldness, including in the academy, when people don't have no idea what's going on with the professor who is right across the hall from them, you know. And the sense of lack of community, I think, is really devastating. What do you think about that?
Well, I think you're clearly right there. I had a talk not long ago with a very fine school administrator, really great guy, and I asked him how things are going, and he said he was discouraged.
Oh, yeah.
And he said it's all compliance today, all compliance. So again, you've got the list of rules, principles, practices, and you're supposed to follow those. And the idea is that the outcomes will be just fine. But of course the outcomes aren't just fine because you got to do more than that, you know. You have to talk to the people you're doing these things to find out what it means to them. So we've got several problems. It isn't just the problem in organizations, schools, especially, but we've got the problem on really on the world scale now, because communication is so easy, and we're drowning in so-called communications. But a lot of people, certainly not, I'm not the only one here, a lot of people are talking about it. What happens in circumstances like that is that people listen only to those they already agree with. And so some of us watch only CNN, others watch only Fox News, and then you've got, you know, all these other folks who come close together, and people don't talk to anyone outside that. So that's something that that we have to talk about. And very closely related to that is the fact that we're unwilling to talk to people with whom we have major disagreements. Now, I think it's absolutely right to oppose Nazism.
Yes.
No question about it. But are there young people who have been persuaded to that way of thinking who could be persuaded to another way of thinking if they heard from other people, if they listened to other people? So even when we get down to the things that we feel, in a sense, we feel most heroic about. I am not a racist, you know.
Right. Okay.
Someone who makes a shady kind of remark is then branded, and we attack the person instead of the idea. So somewhere along the line, we've got to begin thinking how we can talk to people, listen to people, for whom some of their ideas are repugnant. It isn't like saying, well, it's okay, it's just another way of thinking. I'm not saying that at all.
Right.
But you could be living next door to a racist who would come running over to help you if you fell down and broke your leg. I mean, is that possible? Now, does that mean, well, then we don't worry about his racism, he's fine, you know, and begin talking like President Trump, that good people on all sides? You know, I'm not saying that.
Right.
What I'm suggesting is that we have to find a way to talk to one another across all sorts of lines if we have any hope of resolving some of these issues. Now, you perhaps should ask me some questions lest people get the wrong idea from what I've just said.
No, well, here's the thing. When I think about Donald Trump, I think about a person who also grew up in a kind of ethos of competition, where his father was a real estate developer, pushing always, make money, and that kind. And then he goes to business school and studies, this philosophy of competition, of economic superiority, and that comes with a whole. It's very antithetical to the sort of caring approach to life that you and I, people like us, educators like us, who are trying to save the world, are more interested in. So I think Trump is a product of education, is a product of a particular cultural milieu also that needs to be now critiqued. That, this is not working. This is not working. When he speaks, he seems very angry. There's an anger that comes through. There's an authoritarianism that comes through. At the same time, he did identify certain policies that, as far as helping the working class, at least, that we need to bring jobs back, that the liberals were not articulating, so you can tease out something positive. But it's more or less, I think, a deeper systemic educational problem. What do you think about how do we create schools that teach for more loving human beings, caring human beings, not just people who care about making money and profit?
Well, I don't think we do it by preaching.
Okay.
And now take one of the comments that President Trump made that everyone was upset by when he insisted that in the Charlottesville thing, there were good people on both sides. Well, I mean, that's enough to start a fight right there. Yeah. Because we would say, look, there are no good racists. But I would modify that and say that there are people who are racists, and that's bad. But they might have been something else.
Correct.
They might have been something else if there had been loving, persistent enough conversation at the right times and right places, particularly in education, so that when we are fighting things that we should fight, racism and violence, and when I say fight violence, I don't mean with violence. I mean work against it, that we remember that the people who are now embracing beliefs that we would condemn might have been different people if they had had the appropriate conversations with people who oppose those views. You follow what I'm saying there? It isn't a matter of taking a whole slew of people and condemning them. We condemn the act, we condemn the beliefs, but then we ask, how can we get beyond that? How can we get beyond that?
I think one of the...
That's the job of education, right there. So we're not turning out people like that, yeah.
One of the things I love most about teaching English, this is my profession, I teach English at the college level, is to have a room full of people who are engaging, who are connecting. We begin by getting in a circle and going around and just talking about who we are. And it's a project of finding our voices, but it's also a project of creating a center of care in that classroom, a little bubble of care. One of the best things any student has ever said to me was a black woman in Essex County College in Newark, New Jersey, which is a city that was been racked by poverty and violence. She said to me, Professor John, she said, because we go by first names and progressive educators, we go, Professor John, she said, because of this class, she said, I am now able to have a conversation with a stranger. I could never do that before. To have simple conversation with a stranger. So that feeling, but it's hard to explain this to administrators that are always looking at bottom line criteria, forcing you to teach with a textbook, for example, when I know that teaching with textbooks is not, the research says is not good. Very often what I'll do is begin class simply by telling a story. telling a story about my journey to class that day. Something may have happened on the train, or a conversation that I had which taught me something about myself or the world or something. So this kind of spontaneity that I think is also, you say something in this book here, The Challenge to Care, about that, about how you don't need to be an expert all the time in order to teach well. You sort of have a dialogue with the students, and the caring is much more important, that they sense that you're feeling that sense of engrossment with their concerns, and as opposed to a kind of a technocratic approach to teaching.
Well, furthermore, it can be much more intellectually exciting. It's hard to force something to be intellectually exciting. It just doesn't work, you know. You can teach, exercises, definitions, moves, and so forth. But if you really want the work to be intellectually exciting, then you have to open up to dialogue. It's just necessary to do that, and that means that you get off the topic sometimes. And then, if you're a good teacher, you find a way to bring it back on topic, to show how well connected it was right from the start. You know, I mean, it's part of what we mean by good teaching. And when you were mentioning that your students used your first name, all my years of teaching at Stanford, my students always called me Nel. And I never, ever felt a lack of respect anywhere along the line.
That's wonderful. I want to read another excerpt here where you talk about dialogue. And interestingly, when Claudia and I paid you a visit about a month ago here, we sat on your porch, your lovely porch. We sipped white wine. We had a lovely conversation. And I had mentioned to you how important Martin Buber is to my work. And you also said that Buber was important to you. Buber was the great philosopher of dialogue. And also, I don't know if you saw it, but last November, David Brooks published an op-ed piece all about Martin Buber. It was incredible. He even used Martin Buber in the title of the piece, and it was called "Read Buber, Not the Polls." Read Buber, Not the Polls, and it was just phenomenal. I think, Brooks, whatever you feel about his politics, has been pretty good on certain things like community and alienation. And
Yeah. You and I were talking earlier about heroes of civility, and I have them piled up here. Isaiah Berlin and John Stuart Mill, and currently David Brooks is on that line. A hero of civility, because he finds a way to talk with people across these bitter lines. And it's what we need to do. It doesn't mean that you are condoning a belief that should be condemned. It means you're trying to rescue the person who has this abysmal belief. Finding a way to connect with people. And of course, Martin Buber was the inspiration for my initial book on caring. There's a line in Buber that says it right out. In the beginning was the relation. That's the line. And then he goes on to build from there. So when people ask about the feminist influence on the caring book, it was almost subconscious somehow or other. It was at some major conference somewhere in the South where another philosopher drew my attention to it. And I thought, he's right, he's right. And that led me to read a great deal about feminist history and philosophy. But that isn't what started it. What started was Buber's In the Beginning Was the Relation.
Let's stay with feminism for a second here, feminist theory, because there was a book called Woman's Ways of Knowing that came out about 20 years ago, which for me was like just like life-changing, a book, and I can't remember all the authors. You may know them. Kalinchi, Terul, but they were a group of women, and they were all academics and intellectuals. They were sitting in a hot tub at a convention, and they were all just having a conversation in this hot tub. And they found out that a lot of their concerns were overlapping and intersecting, and out of that conversation, that authentic dialogue, relaxing conversation, came this idea of women's knowledge and the kind of caring that women bring into the world. Oh yes, which has to do with child rearing, which has to do with caring about the sick and the aged, which has not been certainly not been acknowledged to the point of compensating in our society in terms of monetarily. Men's work has always been considered the serious, important work, where women's work, which is like the glue that holds society together, has been marginalized. And it seems as if too many women now are trying to become like men. And Nell went off to try to find something. What were you looking to find, Nell?
I can go in the next room and bring back the Clinchy book.
Oh,
it's
please.
a wonderful book.
Oh yeah, no,
Yeah.
I think that that's how I get. I get like you. I get excited when someone mentions a book, and I want to run and get it and show it. But this idea. So, do you think that the fact that we had a woman candidate for president this year, for example, do you think that there is this movement towards accepting women's knowledge as important, as rigorous? You also say somewhere that the work of care is not mushy. It's not this kind of this kind of touchy-feely thing that you marginalize, but it is really important in the world.
Well, you asked me a couple questions there. First, about the female candidate for president. I voted for.
Okay.
I confess that in the primary I voted for Bernie Sanders.
Okay. Bernie. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Well,
He has a feminine side to him. He seems like he's passionate. Caring, yes.
Well, and he doesn't change his mind from one day to the next. You can pretty well count on what he says. And I think actually, although there's much good to be said about the female candidate, she didn't come across as someone in dialogue, You never quite felt that you were involved in a real dialogue there. So that's something to think about. And when we talk about the feminist literature, I became particularly interested in women's history and the kinds of things that women have stood for, argued for, lived by. And so then you begin to look more carefully at people like Jane Addams. All the work that she did for children to improve neighborhoods. She had the courage to stand up against World War I, which one of my other heroes, John Dewey, did not.
Right.
She stood up against World War I and had a very hard time after that, was almost condemned for it. And the first woman in the U.S. Congress lost her seat there because she voted against World War I. And didn't get back in.
What was her name then?
Oh
yeah. Okay.
Let me think. It'll come to me.
Okay.
No.
Okay.
It'll come to me.
Yes.
And she got back just in time to vote no for World War II, and that finished her. She was done for. That was the end of it. But see, it's stories like that we should be willing to spend a little time on to talk about the end results of that kind of courage. It isn't the sort of courage where you take someone out by the sword, It's
there's the doors. Let me. We're in this lovely
little
old home on Ocean Grove of yours.
Yes.
So there's a little creaky door that was
some
open
wind
and
coming
closed.
in on the
Wind
other side.
coming in.
Okay.
Beautiful house on the Jersey Shore in a beautiful, magical town of Ocean Grove with Nel Noddings having this fabulous dialogue, very enriching, very nourishing. As far as feminism, the first time I met Gloria Steinem, which is about 5 years ago, she was in a dialogue with Bell Hooks at the New School on stage on the auditorium there, the Joseph Urban Auditorium on 12th Street, and I stayed till the very end till I could go up and give her a hug. And I said, this is a hug from my grandmothers and from my mom, who grew up in the pre-feminist era, Well, my mom grew up in this sort of, the cusp of where feminism was just beginning. Anyway, yeah. But I wanted to read this quote also from you, from your book, The Challenge to Care. And this is about dialogue. And you say, dialogue is the second essential component of moral education. My use of the term dialogue is similar to that of Paulo Freire, 1970. It is not just talk or conversation, certainly not an oral presentation of argument in which the second party is merely allowed to ask an occasional question. Dialogue is open-ended. That is, in a genuine dialogue, neither party knows at the outset what the outcome or decision will be. As parents and teachers, we cannot enter into dialogue with children when we know that our decision is already made. It is maddening to young people, or any people, to engage in quote-unquote dialogue with a sweetly reasonable adult who cannot be persuaded and who, in the end, will say, "Here's how it's going to be. I tried to reason with you." We do have to talk this way at times, of course, but we should not pretend that this is dialogue. Dialogue is a common search for understanding, empathy, or appreciation. It can be playful or serious, logical or imaginative, goal or process-oriented, but it is always a genuine quest for something undetermined at the beginning. That's wonderful. When I read that, I really remember what dialogue actually is. It's very hard to forget what dialogue is now in a society in which we watch news shows that are, I don't know how dialogical they are. In some ways, you might say they're anti-dialogical. People talk from points that they're just simply trying to get their point across. They come out of think tanks. They're well-funded. There are these arguments. But when have you seen anybody on TV say, "Oh, that was a good point"? Or, when have you seen an epiphany happen? Like, "Oh, that's interesting. Let's see." Real dialogue is much messier, it's much more, and it's the kind of work that we do in classrooms, but we don't see it on media, right? We don't see it on media. We're trying to bring dialogue to media with this show, and we welcome your presence here on our show.
Well, dialogue is very closely related to one of the central concepts in care theory, and that's attention. And so often in education, when we think of attention, we think of the students listening to the teacher. And what they are to hear, they're pretty much told at the beginning. Listen, you'll be tested on this. Right. And so you're attending, but you're attending with your own objective in mind. I'm listening because I'm going to have to answer this somewhere along the line. I have to prove that I know it. The kind of attention in care theory is empathic attention, where and it's receptive. We let the other enter us, so to speak. We don't project ourselves into the other's situation so much as we just have sort of an open window, and we allow ourselves to be affected by the other. There are a lot of people who can't do that. It's just too scary, because in a sense you're giving up what you were thinking about 5 minutes ago. You think you've given up your to-do list and all the things you're planning, and you're just open to the other. The idea is to feel what the other is feeling. As Simone Weil put it beautifully, she said, the question is, what are you going through? What are you going through? And see how different that is from projecting yourself into the other situation and asking, how would I feel in that situation? Now that's a good question too, and it is worth exploring. But that isn't the fundamental question in caring. It isn't how would I feel in that situation. It's how does the person, do you feel right now? You know?
Wow. And Simone Weil, is that her name? Simone Weil. How do you spell the last name?
W-E-I-L.
She was, very quickly, maybe you could tell who she was. She was an existentialist thinker. She was a philosopher.
Right, right. And very powerful writer.
French, I think.
Yes.
Yes. So I want to read one more piece here about also helping others to become the best people that they could be. That is a goal of education, or should be a goal of education, or just in life in general,
right.
Where it's yeah.
But again, not predefining what that best is.
No.
Right? I mean, that's something that drives me nuts, you know.
Right. Yes.
It's something that has to be defined in dialogue, because as, let's say you were one of my students and we were talking about things, instead of finishing up by letting you know, now you can be the best, as I define best, we have redefined best. Together. Yeah.
Oh, that's wonderful. As a project, as a dialogue. So this quote here is where you mentioned Martin Buber, and you talk about this idea of confirmation. The fourth component of moral education from the perspective of caring is confirmation. Martin Buber, 1965, described confirmation as an act of affirming and encouraging the best in others. When we confirm someone, we spot a better self and encourage its development. We can do this only if we know the other person well enough to see what he or she is trying to become. Formulas and slogans have no place here. We do not set up a single ideal or set of expectations for everyone to meet, but we identify something admirable, or at least acceptable, struggling to emerge in each person we encounter. The person working toward a better self... I'll keep reading. The person working toward a better self must see the attribute or goal as worthy. Oh, that was so interesting. We actually had to interrupt the reading because Nell got a phone call from one of her 7th grade classmates who she went all through high school with, who she hadn't heard from in years, and she was so happy to hear from this person. And that's you never know what's going to go on around here, right, Nell?
That's right.
Okay. So to continue this piece about confirmation, the person working toward a better self must see the attribute or goal as worthy, and we too must see it as at least morally acceptable. We do not confirm people in ways we judge to be wrong. So helping people grow, trying to find, whether in friendship, whether with neighbors, whether with strangers, whether with students, helping people achieve what they want to achieve, to go for their dreams.
Well, see, it just underscores what we were just talking about, the whole idea of attention. Yes. Because how would we know what the other aspires to if we don't have any dialogue, if we don't shut up and listen to the other, Yes. If all we do is talk. Now, of course, we all use the sort of simple definition of confirmation daily also. After all, I was a math teacher for a good many years, and I was sitting next to you, helping you with quadratic equations, and you finally got one right, I would say, you've got it, you've got it. But that doesn't mean that that's the solution of your life's problems, That isn't the sort of confirmation Buber had in mind, that sort of trivial confirmation.
And I'm learning from you just in the world, Nell, and how you responded to that phone call, not as an interruption, but as something welcome, or as a welcome interruption. Your kindness, the way you received it, the way life is an adventure, one moment at a time. You talk about also how a classroom in a school could be like a family, like a heterogeneous family, where we're all together, we're all here. You talk about your work as a mother, how all of that has impacted your your work as a teacher.
Sure. Yeah, that brings up another very, very important concept in care theory, and that's continuity. We really need some time to be with one another. In the classroom, we need time for conversation and dialogue. We've been talking about that. But I really think that we ought to consider keeping students and teachers together for 3 years rather than one at the elementary level.
Yeah.
I mean, the most wonderful experience I had was in my very first years of teaching. I was prepared to be a high school math teacher, and there didn't happen to be any high school math jobs at that moment where I was going to be living, and I had an emergency credential to teach elementary school, so I got a job as a 6th grade teacher. It was one of the most wonderful things that ever happened to me, really. I remember saying to the principal in the hall one day, "But they're so little." And she looked shocked. She stood back and she said, "I assure you they're perfectly normal." Well, I didn't mean they weren't normal, but I had been doing my student teaching with high school kids, and they were all taller than I, you know. So at the end of the year, the junior high was overcrowded, and we were asked if we'd stay together for another year. 7th grade, a grade that most teachers would just as soon skip teaching, you know. But I thought, definitely, I would stay with these kids. And almost all of them decided to stay. 3 girls decided no, they would go to junior high because they wanted to meet new boys. They were kind of tired of the boys. So off they went, and we added a few more kids. And at the end of 7th grade, we were asked if we'd stay together for another year, 8th grade. And we did. And that year, I don't know, it was 1 or 2 of the girls who had left came back, because they'd had enough of the boys. they just meant. I mean, we remember these funny things, but we're more likely to remember them if there's some continuity, if we've stayed together long enough to know each other. And I hear from some of those people even today. Similarly, when I did get on to teaching high school math, there were lots of kids I taught for their whole 4 years of high school math. One of my own daughters, in fact.
Look at that.
And it's a wonderful experience, and it's a time saver too, because you know where you left off in June, you know. So, well, it's something that we really should give some thought to.
Wow. And I want to give a shout out to my parents, Gene and Jack Braden, who live 2 blocks over on Heck Avenue here in Ocean Grove, who Claudia and I are visiting, who met in art class at Fort Lee High School, who are both very creative people. My dad is a painter. He was an actor when he was a young man. My mom writes for Blogfinger, the local blog, and she takes photographs. And just visiting them is so nice, just being in their living room and just having breakfast and sitting and having conversation. Things like that are so important. Walking around the streets down here in Ocean Grove and Asbury Park, the sense of community that I feel is a big part of our visit here. But I want to just ask Claudia, dear, if you could just show the room that we're in. This is the study room. This is the library, and a lot of work gets done here, important work. And I want to show the degree for Nel, Columbia College over there, and there you go. And just look around, see the bookshelf, and see the room that we're in. Little intellectual enclave, and there we go. Lots and lots of books. In particular, there's a whole shelf dedicated to John Dewey, who was one of my heroes. 2 shelves dedicated to Dewey.
Philosophy, yeah.
Probably, if you look at our 150 plus episodes that we've done, Nell, I would say at least 80% have a mention of John Dewey. So he's absolutely essential, certainly in my thinking, and I think he ought to be more well known by teachers and even in the general society than he is. just to finish up, why don't we go downstairs and we can sit on the porch, or we could look at, you have a garden outside. Nell is also a wonderful gardener, so she puts her nurturing skills into practice gardening, as well as in her relationships with people and in teaching. So we're going to finish up and talk a little bit about your biography, maybe how you became the person you are today.
Okay. As people were looking around this room, you no doubt were wondering where the computer is.
Oh, where is the computer?
The computer is in my office. I have an office separate.
Okay.
That's where all the work that I don't want to do gets done.
Okay.
And here in the library is all the work that I want to do. See? So,
Oh, wonderful, wonderful. Okay. Okay, so we wanted to show our viewers Nell's lovely garden here in Ocean Grove on Webb Avenue, this beautiful garden, and talk a little bit about your garden.
The roses are doing well. They'll do even better in the fall. You can see that there's quite a few blooming now. And over
Okay.
on the... What? Careful.
Nell just saved my life. I almost fell. You are caring, Nell. Wow, you're so caring. You saved me.
Over on the ocean side here, you can see a row of
Come on this side.
a row of sedums that are getting ready to bloom. You can see the beginnings of the blooms. They'll be so pretty in the fall. And right behind them, the sweet autumn clematis, which everybody stops to sniff now because it smells so good.
Look at that. And I just saw a butterfly there. What a scene here. This is the scenic, it's just amazing. It's like a postcard here.
And out on the north side, we have the vegetable garden.
Let's take a look at the vegetable garden now. Okay, so now we're approaching the vegetable garden here on the other side of the street, because Nell, your house spans two sides of the street here. Okay.
Right, and you can see that the corn is about finished, but it's the first year that I've had success with corn. It was wonderful, but I think that's because I followed the proper instructions this year with spacing and fertilizer and all the rest of it. And then there's eggplant and zucchini and broccoli and tomatoes.
Oh, show the tomatoes, baby, close up. They're still green, but...
Well, no, there are a lot of red ones I've picked.
Oh.
The red ones are in the kitchen. And this area that is all volunteer petunias was the onion garden, and I've got a barrel of onions in the house. And then the other biggie is green beans, and I'll be picking more green beans tomorrow. They've been wonderful. And then I've got a lot of cabbages if anyone wants to stop by for some cabbage.
Oh my goodness. And Claudia, show the beauty of the street also. These houses are like gingerbread houses down here. You feel like you're in a fairy tale land in some way.
Except when you have to take care of all the repairs. That is not fairyland anymore.
This is my fantasy of like the Nel Noddings utopia, where the utopian world of caring, the kind of world of peace and love that we're trying to create is kind of, there's a sort of physical representation here in the beauty of this town. For me, anyway, that's the metaphor.
But what you need desperately is good plumbers, carpenters,
Good
painters.
plumbers. Yes.
And we've got them in this neighborhood, so I'm thankful for that.
We're going to sit on the porch now with Nell, and we're going to just reflect for 5 more minutes as we finish out this show. We always like to have some reflection at the end, and that's part of my pedagogical process.
Okay, good.
Okay, we're going to finish our dialogue. I'm going to finish my dialogue here with Nel Noddings on her front porch, overlooking the Atlantic Ocean in Ocean Grove. And I just want to say what a pleasure it is, Nel, to be in dialogue with you, whether we're on the air or off the air. It's so enriching. Claudia, too, is learning so much from you. I could see that. Both learning so much from you. And as we wind up this I like to say dialogue instead of interview. I'm trying to get away from that word interview. I think dialogue is something that Buber felt strongly about, that Freire felt strongly about, and we feel strongly about. So let's call it a dialogue instead of an interview. Maybe you could offer some advice, let's say, to the Secretary of Education, and what would be your advice on how to really radically transform our school systems to make them places of caring?
Well, that would be mighty hard to do in a couple minutes.
Okay.
we have left.
And now the sirens are going off. I don't know what's going on.
All right, no, we were talking.
The sirens just went off. Now they stopped, so we can continue. What advice would you offer, sort of like the elevator speech? If you had gotten to the elevator with the Miss Betsy DeVos, what would you tell her?
Well, first I would try to set up a time when she and I could talk in some depth. Talk honestly and openly about what's going on in education. We need to get away from this tightly prescribed curriculum and performance, which we have now. We just have to get away from it. It isn't real education. When all people do is absorb, or we hope they absorb, and then disgorge a set of facts, that is not real education. We need the time for dialogue. We certainly need, and I hope a lot of people will agree with me on this, interdisciplinary studies. We need to tackle certain kinds of topics, particularly all the topics that have to do with citizenship and moral life and friendship, all these deep things in life. We need to tackle them in all of our subjects. We don't need to add a course in philosophy to do this. We need to talk about them in math class and in biology class, in history class, and in every class. And at least that there is a slightly encouraging sign that there are more people interested in interdisciplinary studies now, and it is high time.
Wow. And could you give us any advice for me and Claudia with our show in terms of, we're trying to be the go-to show for more quality dialogue on education, more substantive ideas, but it can be very difficult. You were up against all these big corporate-funded shows, and we're just a little voice out there in the wilderness. Can you give us any encouragement for how to continue with this?
Well, I really don't know what to say there, except to continue, invite people into dialogue on the matter. Elementary school teachers, secondary school teachers. I think now we're getting the results of the sirens we heard just a minute ago.
Okay.
They're
not coming after us, are they? The FBI is not
either
closing
the police
in.
or the ambulances or whatever coming along. And it wouldn't hurt to have interviews with some people working in the science area on interdisciplinary studies, just to show that it isn't just educators who'd be interested in this. I mean, if you could get a talk with E.O. Wilson at Harvard, for example, it would be wonderful. His work on interdisciplinary studies is just quite fascinating.
I know you say something also about people who make things. It's important, craftspeople, that we should care about things and objects and artworks.
Sure. Yeah, and it comes down to we want kids to be their best. We've got so many different ways of looking at that. It isn't a matter of defining a priori what best is and then driving for that, but rather finding out, what is the kid good at? What does he want to do? What would he really like to do? How can I help him to do it? Or how can I gently discourage him if I think it's really a crazy idea, It isn't a matter of teachers agreeing with everything the kids say. I mean, that's just silly. Sometimes the dialogue leads us into a very difficult series of dialogues. We've got to keep that in mind, too.
Well, we're on the porch with Nel Noddings in Ocean Grove, New Jersey, and we're so grateful to have you on our program today, Nel. This has been a wonderful, continues to be a friendship that's growing and evolving with us, and it's just such a pleasure to feature you and to talk to our audience and have Claudia here, the three of us on the porch with Nel. Keep on keeping on, keep on your wonderful work about caring, and we need it so much more than ever today. Thank you.
Thanks, John. I've enjoyed it.